His grandfather used to say that the earth remembers warmth longer than wood remembers fire. Thomas Brennan heard those words again in his mind as he stood before the limestone cliff face, its gray surface pocked with natural alcoves and fissures, feeling the cold October wind cut through his worn canvas jacket. The fabric was thin from years of wear, offering little protection against the gusts that swept down from the mountains, carrying with it the metallic scent of approaching winter. He was 42 years old, lean and weathered from years of construction work that had dried up when the mills closed, and he was about to do something everyone in town would call foolish. His wife, Sarah, stood beside him, her dark hair pulled back under a wool cap, their 12-year-old daughter, Emma, shivering between them, her teeth chattering slightly despite the heavy coat wrapped around her thin frame. They had lost their rental house to a landlord who sold the property, lost most of their savings to medical bills when Sarah's mother passed. And now they had this: 8 acres of rocky hillside land Thomas inherited from his grandfather, and an idea that made people laugh when he explained it. Northern Montana, October 1978. The town of Millbrook sat in a valley where winter temperatures regularly dropped to 15 below zero, where heating oil cost more each year, and where Thomas had watched his neighbors burn through cords of firewood trying to keep their drafty houses warm. His plan was different. He would build their home into the south-facing cliff that dominated their property, using the earth itself as insulation, designing the structure to capture solar heat during the short winter days and hold it through the long nights. He had spent months at the library reading about thermal mass, about how ancient peoples built cliff dwellings that stayed comfortable year-round, about the constant 55-degree temperature that existed just a few feet underground. The numbers made sense. The physics made sense. But when he tried to explain it at the hardware store or the diner, people shook their heads and smiled the way you smile at a child who believes in fairy tales. You're gonna live in a cave? That was Dale Morrison, who owned the feed store and considered himself an expert on everything. Like some kind of caveman? Tommy, you got a family to think about. Winter's coming and you want to dig a hole in a hill? The men around the counter laughed, and Thomas felt his face flush, but he kept his voice steady. Not a cave, a shelter built into the cliff with proper insulation, ventilation, and passive solar design. The earth maintains a constant temperature. Once we heat the mass, it holds that warmth. Dale snorted. Passive solar. You've been reading those hippie magazines. You know what holds warmth? A real house with real walls and a real furnace, not some hole in the ground. Thomas bought his supplies and left, but he heard the laughter follow him out the door, echoing in his ears, long after he climbed into his truck. Sarah squeezed his hand in the truck, her fingers cold even through her gloves. "They'll see," she said quietly. "When it works, they'll see." They started digging on a Monday morning in early October. Thomas had borrowed a small excavator from a former co-worker who believed in him, or at least believed enough to rent him the machine cheap. The plan was to excavate back into the cliff about 20 feet, creating a space roughly 30 feet wide and 12 feet high at the entrance, tapering naturally with the rock. He would leave the southern face open for a wall of windows and a heavy timber frame, but the other 3 sides and the roof would be surrounded by earth and stone. The cliff face itself was solid limestone, which meant good structural integrity and excellent thermal mass. Emma helped clear brush and small rocks, her breath making clouds in the cold air, her small hands working steadily despite the chill that made her fingers stiff and clumsy, while Sarah marked measurements with stakes and string. The excavator's diesel engine echoed off the surrounding hills as Thomas carefully carved into the ancient stone, following the natural contours, working with the rock rather than against it. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the mineral scent of freshly exposed limestone, and the sound of metal against stone rang out like a bell across the empty valley. The first week, people drove by slowly, staring. Some stopped. "You're really doing this?" asked Helen Carter, who taught at the elementary school. "Building into the rock?" Sarah nodded, her hands dirty from mixing mortar for the retaining wall they were building at the entrance. "We are. It'll be warm, safe, and we won't need to buy heating oil." Helen looked doubtful. "But what about moisture? What about cave-ins? Tommy, I know times are hard, but there are programs, assistance you could apply for." Thomas climbed down from the excavator, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the 40-degree temperature. "We don't need assistance. We need shelter that makes sense. This rock has been here for millions of years. It's not going anywhere, and moisture moves through stone predictably. We're installing proper drainage and ventilation." But Helen wasn't the worst. That distinction belonged to Carl Hendricks, who owned the lumber yard and had expected Thomas to buy thousands of dollars in framing lumber for a conventional house. When Thomas only ordered timber for the front wall and some interior supports, Carl made his feelings clear. "You're making a mistake," he said, loud enough for other customers to hear. "A dangerous mistake. That cliff could collapse. Water could flood you out. You could suffocate in there. And when winter really hits, when it's 30 below and the wind is howling, you're gonna freeze to death in your little cave while your wife and daughter watch. That's what's gonna happen." Thomas loaded his truck in silence, but his hands shook with anger, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Emma, sitting in the passenger seat, had heard every word. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice small and uncertain. "It will work, right?" He looked at his daughter's worried face and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. "It'll work, sweetheart. The math doesn't lie. The physics doesn't lie. We just have to build it right." The one person who didn't laugh was Robert Chen, a retired engineer who had moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier and lived in a small, meticulously efficient house on the edge of town. He showed up one afternoon in mid-October, watched Thomas work for 20 minutes, then walked over with a thermos of coffee. "Your angle of excavation is good," he said without preamble. "You're following the natural pitch of the stone. Smart." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth of the cup seeping into his cold hands. "You don't think I'm crazy?" Robert smiled. "I think you're doing what humans did for thousands of years before we convinced ourselves that burning fossil fuels was the only way to stay warm. I've seen earth-sheltered homes in Korea, in China, in parts of Europe. They work. But you need to be careful with your ventilation system. You need air exchange without losing your heat." They talked for an hour about airflow, about moisture barriers, about thermal mass calculations. When Robert left, he handed Thomas a folder of sketches and notes. "I drew these up last night," he said. "Some ideas for your ventilation, and if you need help, I've got time." The excavation took 3 weeks. Thomas worked 12-hour days, carefully removing rock, hauling out debris, shaping the interior space. The back wall curved naturally, following a vein of softer stone that had eroded over millennia. He left it exposed, knowing that the limestone would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. The ceiling was roughly 10 feet high at the deepest point, giving them plenty of headroom. He installed drainage channels along the base of the walls, leading to a gravel sump outside the entrance, ensuring that any moisture would be directed away from the living space. Sarah and Emma worked on the front wall, building forms for a concrete foundation that would support the timber frame and windows. They mixed concrete by hand, bag after bag, until their backs ached and their hands were raw. blisters forming and breaking and forming again. But the work felt good. It felt like progress, like they were building something real and lasting with their own hands. By early November, the basic excavation was complete, and Thomas began the framing. He had designed the front wall with maximum southern exposure, using salvaged double-pane windows he bought from a demolition company for a fraction of retail price. The windows would let in winter sunlight, which would strike the limestone walls and floor, heating the thermal mass. At night, he would cover the windows with insulated shutters Sarah was sewing from layers of denim, wool, and reflective material. The timber frame went up over 2 weeks, heavy posts and beams that Robert helped him raise and secure. They used traditional joinery, mortise and tenon, because Thomas had learned the craft from his grandfather, and because it felt right to build this shelter with old methods. Emma helped drill holes and pound pegs, her small hands surprisingly strong, her face set with concentration as she worked. "It's starting to look like something," she said one evening as they stood back to admire the frame silhouetted against the sunset, the sky streaked with orange and purple. "It looks like home." The roof was the trickiest part. Thomas built a strong timber structure that extended from the top of the front wall back into the cliff, where it met solid rock. On top of the timbers, he laid a waterproof membrane, then 6 inches of rigid foam insulation, then another membrane, then drainage matting, then finally a layer of soil and native grasses. The roof would be invisible from above, just another part of the hillside. The insulation would prevent heat loss while the earth provided thermal mass and protection from wind. Robert helped him calculate the load-bearing requirements and check his work. "You're building something that will outlast most houses in this valley," Robert said. "The earth doesn't rot. It doesn't blow away. It just sits there, doing its job." Thomas hoped he was right. He hoped this wasn't the disaster Carl Hendricks predicted. He hoped his daughter wouldn't remember this as the winter her father's pride froze them all to death. Inside, they built simple walls to divide the space into 3 rooms, a main living area with the kitchen and a wood stove for backup heat, a bedroom for Thomas and Sarah, and a smaller bedroom for Emma. The walls were framed with 2x4s and insulated with fiberglass, then covered with salvaged wood paneling that Sarah cleaned and oiled until it glowed warm in the lamplight, the grain of the wood showing through rich and deep. They installed the wood stove in the main room, not because Thomas thought they would need it much, but because Sarah insisted on a backup, and because the building inspector required it. The stovepipe ran up through the roof with proper clearances and a spark arrestor. Thomas built simple furniture, beds, a table, chairs, shelves. Everything was functional, sturdy, made to last. They had no money for anything decorative, but Sarah hung curtains she sewed from old sheets, and Emma arranged rocks and pine cones on the shelves until the space felt lived in, felt like it belonged to them. The ventilation system was Robert's design. 2 pipes ran from the back of the shelter up through the earth and roof, emerging 30 feet apart on the hillside above. One was an intake, drawing fresh air down into the shelter where it passed through a simple heat exchanger Robert built from copper tubing. The other was an exhaust, allowing stale air to escape while the heat exchanger captured most of its warmth. The system was passive, requiring no electricity, driven by natural convection and the temperature differential between inside and outside. They tested it with smoke from a candle, watching the thin stream get pulled toward the exhaust pipe, moving steadily through the still air. "It works," Robert said with satisfaction. "You'll have fresh air without losing your heat. Just remember to keep the pipes clear of snow." Thomas marked the pipe locations with tall stakes so he could find them in a blizzard. By the third week of November, they moved in. The shelter wasn't finished. There were still trim pieces to install, shelves to build, a dozen small tasks remaining, but it was livable and winter was coming fast. The first night, Sarah made soup on their propane camp stove, while Thomas got a small fire going in the wood stove, more for comfort than heat. The temperature outside was 28 degrees and dropping. Inside, with no fire, the shelter held at 58 degrees, just from the residual warmth of the day's sunlight on the limestone walls. With the small fire, the temperature climbed to 65, then 70. The stone walls absorbed the heat like a battery charging. Thomas could feel the warmth radiating from the limestone when he placed his palm against it, the surface warm and dry and solid. "It's working," he said quietly, his voice filled with relief and wonder. Sarah smiled, her face relaxed for the first time in months. Emma curled up on her bed with a book, wearing just a sweater, comfortable. Outside, the wind picked up, howling across the valley, but inside, they barely heard it. The earth muffled everything, wrapping them in silence and warmth. The next morning, Thomas woke to find frost on the inside of the windows, but the shelter temperature at 62 degrees. The fire had gone out hours ago, yet the thermal mass was still releasing the heat it had absorbed. He opened the insulated shutters, and sunlight streamed in, striking the back wall, beginning the cycle again. By noon, with bright sun and no fire, the interior temperature reached 72 degrees. By evening, it was 75. Sarah laughed with delight. "We're too warm," she said. "I never thought I'd say that in November in Montana." Thomas cracked one of the windows to let cool air in, balancing the temperature. The system was working better than he had calculated. The thermal mass was performing exactly as the physics predicted. He felt a surge of vindication, but also caution. The real test would come when winter truly arrived, when the temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. December came with cold rain that turned to sleet, the drops hitting the windows with a sound like thrown sand. The town hunkered down, smoke rising from chimneys, cars struggling to start in the mornings. Thomas drove into Millbrook for supplies and ran into Dale Morrison at the post office. "How's the cave working out?" Dale asked with a smirk. "You frozen out yet?" Thomas kept his voice neutral. "We're comfortable. Haven't burned more than a few sticks of firewood. The shelter holds heat at about 70 degrees with minimal input." Dale's smirk faded slightly. "Well, wait till it really gets cold. January, February. That's when you'll see. That's when you'll wish you had a real house." Thomas didn't argue. He just nodded and left. But he noticed a few people in the post office listening with interest, their expressions less skeptical than before. Christmas week brought the first serious cold snap. Temperatures dropped to 5 below zero, then 10 below, then 15 below. The wind came from the north, sustained at 30 miles per hour with gusts to 50. Thomas watched from the shelter entrance as snow blew horizontal across the valley, as trees bent and creaked, as the world turned white and hostile. He closed the heavy insulated door they had built and sealed it tight. Inside, the shelter was utterly silent. The wind was inaudible through the earth and stone. The temperature held at 68 degrees with a tiny fire in the wood stove, burning perhaps 3 small logs over the course of the day. Sarah baked bread in their propane oven, and the smell filled the space, warm and yeasty and comforting. Emma did her homework at the table, wearing a t-shirt. "It feels like we're in a different world," she said, "like the storm isn't even happening." Thomas checked the thermometer outside. 18 below zero. Inside, 68 above. An 86-degree difference maintained by thermal mass, insulation, and a handful of burning wood. On December 28th, the power went out across the valley. An ice storm had brought down lines, and the utility company said it would be days before repairs could be made. Thomas heard about it on their battery-powered radio. The shelter had never had electricity. They used propane lamps and candles for light, a propane stove for cooking, and they didn't need electric heat. But he thought about their neighbors in conventional houses, suddenly without furnaces, without electric space heaters, facing sub-zero temperatures with only fireplaces and wood stoves if they were lucky. He thought about elderly people, about families with small children. He mentioned it to Sarah. Should we let people know they could come here if they need to? She looked around their small space. We don't have much room. No, he agreed, but we have warmth, and that might matter. The next morning, Robert Chen showed up at their door, his face red from cold, ice crystals clinging to his eyebrows and the scarf wrapped around his neck. The power's still out, he said, his breath coming in white clouds. My house is well insulated, but it's dropping below 50 degrees inside. I don't want to impose, but I wondered if I could sit with you folks for a few hours, warm up before I head back. Thomas pulled him inside immediately. Stay as long as you need. We have soup. We have heat. You're welcome here. Robert sank into a chair gratefully, his hands shaking as he held them toward the wood stove. It's 70 degrees in here, he said, wonderingly. Outside it's 20 below and you're maintaining 70 degrees with that tiny fire? Thomas nodded. The thermal mass. Once it's charged, it just holds the warmth. We're barely burning any wood. Robert looked around the shelter with professional appreciation. You did it right. You really did it right. That afternoon, Helen Carter showed up with her elderly mother, both of them bundled in layers of clothing, both of them shivering, their faces pale with cold. I'm sorry to bother you, Helen said, her voice embarrassed. But my furnace is electric, and Mother is so cold, and I heard from Robert that you might have room. Sarah pulled them inside without hesitation. Come in, please. We have space. We have warmth. She settled Helen's mother in the most comfortable chair, wrapped her in a quilt, made her hot tea. The old woman's shivering gradually subsided, color returning to her cheeks. I can't believe how warm it is, she whispered. It's like summer in here. Emma gave up her bedroom for them, rolling out her sleeping bag in the main room without complaint. Thomas added a few more logs to the fire, bringing the temperature up to 75 degrees to help the newcomers warm up faster. The shelter absorbed the heat and held it steady. By evening, 2 more families had arrived, the Kowalskis with their 3 young children, and Jim Peterson, a widower who lived alone and whose house had no fireplace at all. The shelter was crowded now, 11 people in a space designed for 3, but everyone was warm and safe. Thomas and Sarah shared their food, stretching the soup and bread as far as it would go. Robert contributed supplies from his car. Helen had brought some groceries. They pooled everything and made it work. The children played quietly in the corner, while the adults talked in low voices about the storm, about the power outage, about how long it might last. I never thought I'd be grateful for a cave, Jim Peterson said with a rueful smile. But I'm grateful. I'm real grateful. That night, the temperature outside dropped to 28 below zero. The wind chill was calculated at 50 below. It was the kind of cold that could kill in minutes, the kind of cold that made exposed skin freeze in seconds. Inside the shelter, with 11 people and a moderate fire in the wood stove, the temperature held at 78 degrees. The limestone walls radiated gentle warmth. The air was fresh from the ventilation system. People slept on the floor, on the beds, wherever they could find space, and everyone slept warm. Thomas lay awake for a while, listening to the breathing of his unexpected guests, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a deep satisfaction. His grandfather had been right. The earth remembered warmth. The earth held what was given to it and gave it back slowly, generously, keeping them all alive through the darkest night. The power came back on January 2nd, after 5 days. People returned to their homes, thanking Thomas and Sarah profusely, their skepticism replaced by wonder. Helen Carter hugged Sarah. "You saved Mother," she said quietly. "The doctor said another night in the cold could have been serious for her. You saved her." Robert shook Thomas's hand. "I'm going to write about this," he said. "Document it properly. People need to know this is possible." Jim Peterson just nodded, his eyes wet. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for not turning me away." Emma watched them leave from the shelter entrance, then turned to her father. "Everyone was warm," she said. "Everyone was safe." Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. "That's what shelter is supposed to do." The story spread through Millbrook like fire through dry grass. The family that built a shelter into the cliff, the shelter that stayed warm without electricity, the shelter that saved people during the blackout. Suddenly, everyone wanted to see it, to understand how it worked. Thomas gave tours, explaining the principles of thermal mass, passive solar design, earth sheltering. He showed them the limestone walls that absorbed heat, the insulated shutters that prevented heat loss at night, the ventilation system that provided fresh air without wasting warmth. He showed them his calculations, his measurements, his records of interior and exterior temperatures. On the coldest day of January, when it was 32 below zero outside, the shelter maintained 72 degrees inside with a fire so small it barely qualified as a fire. People shook their heads in amazement. Carl Hendricks came by in mid-January, his expression uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "I wanted to see it for myself," he said gruffly. Thomas showed him around without comment. Carl examined the timber frame, the stone walls, the roof structure. He put his hand on the limestone and felt the warmth radiating from deep within the rock. He checked the thermometer outside, then the one inside. Finally, he turned to Thomas. "I was wrong," he said. "I said you were making a mistake. I said you'd freeze. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Thomas extended his hand, and Carl shook it. "I appreciate that," Thomas said. "I know it looked crazy. It looked impossible. But the physics doesn't care what looks crazy. It just works, or it doesn't." Carl nodded slowly. "It works. God help me. It works better than my house, and I've got a furnace running full blast." By February, 3 families in the area had contacted Thomas about designing earth-sheltered homes for them. Robert helped him draw up plans, proper blueprints with engineering specifications. They formed a small partnership, Chen and Brennan Design, offering consultation for sustainable, earth-integrated architecture. The local newspaper ran a feature story with photographs of the shelter, interior and exterior temperature readings, and interviews with the people who had taken refuge there during the blackout. The headline read, "The Shelter That Saved Lives. Local Family Proves Ancient Wisdom Still Works." Dale Morrison read the article at the feed store and admitted, loud enough for everyone to hear, that maybe there was something to this earth-sheltering business after all. Maybe Thomas Brennan wasn't crazy. Maybe he was just smarter than the rest of them. Winter released its grip slowly. March brought warmer days but still cold nights. The shelter's temperature remained stable, requiring almost no heating input as spring approached. Thomas calculated that they had burned less than half a cord of firewood the entire winter, compared to the 4 or 5 cords their neighbors went through. They had spent perhaps $30 on firewood versus the hundreds their neighbors spent on heating oil or electricity. But more than the money saved, more than the vindication of being proven right, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction in having built something that worked with nature instead of against it. He had listened to his grandfather's wisdom, trusted the physics, and created a home that kept his family safe. One evening in late March, as the snow finally began to melt and the first hints of green appeared on the hillsides, the three of them sat at their table eating dinner. The shelter temperature was 68 degrees, with no fire at all, just the warmth of the day's sunlight absorbed by the limestone and slowly radiating back. Emma was doing better in school, no longer distracted by worry about where they would live or whether they would be warm. Sarah had started a small business sewing insulated window coverings for other families, using the techniques she had developed for their own shutters. Thomas had more design work than he could handle, people wanting to learn from what he had built. "We did it," Sarah said quietly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "We really did it." Thomas looked around the shelter, at the stone walls that had kept them warm, at the simple furniture he had built with his own hands, at his wife and daughter safe and healthy. He thought about the people who had laughed, the people who had predicted disaster, and the people who had eventually come to understand. He thought about his grandfather, who had never lived to see this shelter, but whose words had guided every decision. The earth remembers warmth longer than wood remembers fire. It was true. The earth had remembered, had held what they gave it, had given it back when they needed it most. "Yeah," he said, "we did. And now we help others do it too." The shelter stood through that spring and the following summer, its roof invisible under native grasses, its interior cool when the outside temperature climbed into the 90s. In summer, the thermal mass worked in reverse, staying cool and absorbing heat from the air, keeping the shelter comfortable without air conditioning. People came from other towns to see it, to learn from it. A university professor brought students to study the design. A documentary filmmaker spent a week recording interviews and taking measurements. The shelter that everyone had mocked became the shelter that everyone wanted to understand. Thomas gave talks at community centers and schools, always emphasizing the same principles: work with nature, understand the physics, don't be afraid to look foolish before you're proven right. When the next winter came, the shelter performed exactly as it had the year before. 70 degrees inside when it was 20 below outside. Minimal firewood consumption. Perfect comfort. But this time, Thomas and Sarah weren't alone in their earth-sheltered home. 3 other families in the valley had completed their own versions, each adapted to their specific sites, each working with the earth rather than against it. Robert Chen had designed 2 of them. Thomas had consulted on all 3. The idea was spreading, slowly but surely, proving itself with every sub-zero night, every warm interior, every family that stayed comfortable while using a fraction of the energy their neighbors consumed. Years later, when Emma was grown and gone to college, when Thomas's hair had turned gray and his hands were marked with the scars of a lifetime of building, he would stand at the entrance to the shelter and remember that first winter. He would remember the fear, the doubt, the mockery, and the moment when the physics proved itself true. He would remember the people who had taken refuge there, who had been saved by thermal mass and limestone and the ancient wisdom that the earth holds warmth better than anything humans have invented. He would remember his grandfather's words and know that he had honored them, had built something that would last, had proven that the old ways and the new science were not enemies but partners in the work of survival. The shelter still stood, still warm, still welcoming. The earth still remembered, and Thomas Brennan, the man they had laughed at, the man they had called crazy, had given his family and his community something more valuable than vindication. He had given them a way forward, a way to live with the land instead of against it, a way to find warmth in the coldest darkness. That was worth more than all the mockery, all the doubt, all the fear. That was worth everything.